Hello, everybody. I will today be discussing the problem of infinity in respect to um, numbers, the nature of numbers, and plenitude of arithmetic, as I would call it. I don't know if that's a legitimate title, but we'll use it. Now, what exactly is the problem of infinity within the realm of not really math, but philosophy? You could sum up the problem of infinity as the problem of human antithesis. What that means is that in language of philosophy, it is sometimes called um, the first order of language, or the inability to transcend natural language, which is everyday words, everyday utterances, correspond to everyday capacities, sort of thing. Um, and then there's the other issue, for instance, where cardinal numbers, or numbers that don't fit in positive sets. For instance, there's a sort of clause or a sequence of numbers that numerically possess a common identity. However, with the plenitude of arithmetic, or the form of unlimitedness, you don't get a finite set of things that possess a certain quintessential property, um, like quantity, for instance, or just a bare quality. Um, so you could also think of it this way as an infinite amount of digits doesn't limit infinity, but are inseparable aspects of the essential same reality being reflected and around it. What is known of not merely the idea or concept, but what we call neoria or noesis. Noesis is the higher form of um, comprehension rather than cognizing. There's a technical distinction, which is also to say there infinity also means non-contingent realities, or heaven, that is beyond understanding and thought in terms of what is naturally graspable, rather than in the sense of neoria, which goes beyond, for instance, speaking of just liberal arts, doing poetry, or um, doing art, techne. It wouldn't apply there. Infinity also means without end or beginning. Yet there is a beginning occurring not within infinity itself, but as properties and acts that cannot be calculated one by one or qua one qua. And to find infinity in a cataphatic way, but that is zero to infinity. This is usually what you might find modern mathematicians who are indebted to Husserl. He was a philosopher in the early 20th century, and people who are influenced by dilotheist logic. They do affirm beyond double negatives. Would be the equivalent of a double split knot experiment in quantum theory, which doesn't align with the the ontology or the philosophy regarding reduction of materialism, which is another topic. But that zero to infinity is an act of absolute unlimited movement that transcends beginning and end, because there is no derivative conceptualization but an infinite unfolding. So what this means is that infinity isn't really the negation of quantitative arithmetic that you get in classical arithmetic, or rather a quantitative calculation of numbers that towards infinity, because it's not infinity, though it is one mode in which infinity manifests as I said, unfolding, whilst it is not reducible, because it has something we call in philosophy called non-identity. It's simply to say that it possesses a specific negative property which cannot be among a common quality or a common universal, because it's outside the set in terms of math. Infinite qua infinite, for instance, cannot be understood at all through just simple positive predication, its apophatic mode of thought that infinity equals infinity, whatever that means, but we know what it is not. So it is speaking of the delimitation, not limitation. So there's the technical word or way of speaking and predicating of infinity isn't to say that infinity is something that has nothing to do with sets, but rather the mode of infinity is distinct from just infinity. Because the mode isn't, for instance, merely to do with what is in reference in terms of us speaking, but the antithesis, the modality of infinity itself, whilst it cannot be encapsulated within the interior. So there's the interior and the exterior mode of infinity, which again, there's different forms and levels of infinity, without saying infinity is just a form, but it encompasses forms, because this is also the ground of universals, and the particular modes in which infinity is at all. And what that means, for instance, is that when we predicate, okay, that's what we know of infinity. Those are essential reflections of infinity. They're not merely causally inert, but that it is one act without assigning an actual name to it in a homogeneous sense, or a part of a genus, because a genus is a classification among a sort of a species, genus. Infinity is not a genus, and neither is it merely a concept, because it transcends concept the way that I'm referring to concepts to be. So in terms of Aristotle's 10 categories, right, and among Plato and Proclus and Ammonius and all those, and the commonly understood ancient view of being, for Proclus in his metaphysics and the Platonic theology, hypostasis or hypostasis, however you want to pronounce. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I know, but the hypostasis, if you look at the way that Proclus designates the 5 levels of being, the 6 levels of being, like you get in the Porphyrian tree. But Porphyry does the same thing. The highest category isn't merely a highest among the chain of being, but underlies the chains of beings themselves as a sort of connective tree. Using that metaphor is apophatic, and that's the dynamic to the hypokimenon. The Latin word is an analogous to that of hypostasis, not in the biological sense I'm referring to. I'm referring to the highest principle cause of being within infinity itself. So infinity would have a hypostasis, because it must have particularities to it, meaning modes that it subsists as qua subsists. So for instance, if you read any introduction to logic, when you come across this issue of double negatives, right? I'll give you an example. Within a sentence, right, you express a negative meaning in its grammatical form as not in the format E or O propositions. Alternatively, an affirmation can be achieved with double negatives. Cases which interpret meaning in context of decide the quality and quantity of the relative proposition. So we do that through syllogism, which is, again, among first-order Quadratic logic. I'll give an example. Within the realm of syntax of logic, you would classify things pertaining to a species or genus, as I said before, meaning it belongs to a community or homogeneous identity that is universally predicated of its particular qualitative identity. Qualitative identity refers to, from memory, it refers to, in philosophy, when something possesses multiple identities in terms of what it expresses itself to be, goodness or being or loving, for instance. Those are properties of it. Qualitative identity. Or it refers to that it participates in that modality, that mode, i.e. qualitative identity that we're predicating it off. Cats, for instance, participate in a mode or property that it actualizes in a singular form of a particular identity that is becoming, whilst remaining a cat. Again, this is an example, as I said, of double negatives. You can get third negatives, triple negatives, if you want to call it that, whilst remaining a cat. This mode of thought, identifying within logic, the cat is by nature and isn't reducible to a particular quality it possesses intrinsically and homogeneously. The cat, however, doesn't need this quality to be identified for its genus, because the point of the mode of negative thought or negative predication is that certain qualities that a cat has isn't essential. It's a non-essential accidental composition within that form of, when identifying even that form of unity is not essential. You can have essential accidents, as Aristotle says in his Metaphysics. The cat, however, doesn't need its quality. It's not a contradiction, but a metaphysical identity. That's a necessary quantities or particular forms, that is, genus takes on a particular. Sometimes it's under the category of property that this cat is red whilst not being red, but grounds redness naturally. So, for instance, if you do get a cat that does naturally possess red, without red being, of course, in some sense proper to the catness, like the class cat, universal, doesn't need red, but sometimes it does have red. Again, it's a both end situation, not an either or. This is due to the natural synthesizing or natural synthesis of homogeneous identity being universal and classified species Aristotle, and it imitating and instantiating its particular concrete subsistence, in which it gives its hypostasis. The law of identity, along with time, came into existence. Never mind that. I didn't mean to read that. The question is not how, but what. Identity has different modes of existence that are both apophatic and positive. For instance, no cats or dogs, or no dogs or cats are one mode. The God isn't the world, and the world isn't God. It is a logical, chronological identity of the world being compared to God, and not to God, the world. To the world, because God transcends all human antithesis, conceives ideas and concepts that are created in their finite modalities, that speaks of God's attributes. That's just one analogy, example. So, even though there are disjunctions within the purely logical form, it still presupposes the necessity, in terms of logical necessity, of an ontological commitment or an a priori assumption about the metaphysical necessity outside of purely logical synthesis or synthetic forms. I know that's throwing out a jargon of words. But it's like, for instance, saying being not being, or being that is not being. Well, you need a context and a paradigm. You couldn't just throw that out. Same thing back to what I was originally saying about infinity, is that you can only go so far in terms of propositional content to encapsulate within the interior and the exterior modes of natural thought, not merely conjugations in terms of what you get in grammar or making sentences, but what it corresponds to in terms of its type to archetype prototype relationship that is either intrinsic or extrinsic forms that are acts of relations. So they're relational and communicable. This also becomes a problem within the controversy of ancient nominalist thought and ancient strong hardcore realist thought or Platonic realist thought, but he gets into the discussion of abstract objects. For instance, an example would be is mereology, right? No matter how many times you count parts, you cannot merely separate parts from what it pertains to in a sense that it's integral. Because to have its parts, you speak of the sum of its parts within the whole unity, not really a dialectical antithesizing of opposition, because parts can oppose themselves. That's retarded. So it's a false dialectic in terms of that, which most philosophers, as far as they're concerned, can't go beyond because they're stuck in this problem of antithesizing, and you think the problem is not enough antithesizing. When fortiori, that's false in fortiori, because we can prove it in other ways than merely just using logic. It's not enough. I'll give you another example. Rudy Rocker, in his book on Infinity Mind, page 209, speaks of, the cardinal approximations of many different sets. He gives a diagram of infinity with a y-axis that's 80-degree figure with infinity. They're using the symbol to represent the omega. The omega point would be the equivalent of the highest category for Proclus in his metaphysics in the 6 categories, 7 with Porphyry. The next group, omega and V and infinity, or Aleph in the Hebrew, brings out the still higher order 1 and many distinctions. If we trust the class of all ordinals as the single absolutely infinite number, omega, then we can ask about the relation between omega and such wider class V of all sets. In terms of vertical growth, omega and V are as long as possible, but there's a view of a set theory that regards sets rising horizontal process of growth out from spine of ordinals. If horizontal growth is kept to a minimum, one gets Gödel's universe L of constructible sets, but it is generally believed that the universe is very much wider than L. Omega is a 1 in the sense of being a form of a simple concept infinity, while V is a many in the sense of being the form of a complex concept of all sets. So what he's discussing is what I was saying earlier about the problem of, numbers, the properties and the sets, the classes, the classification, and the limitation of just propositional logic, whatever you want to call it, in terms of first order predicate logic, and not merely language itself is the issue. It's not what we're saying at all, or I'm saying. As I've said in the beginning about discussing the problem of infinity, is not there's an actual problem, but trying to understand it more or less is what we mean. To keep it simple, even though it's not a simple topic. I'll give you another example. I've made a small diagram in terms of classical logic A equals B, and B and A plus A, B, then B. Either it's A or B, it can't be both, neither can B take on the numerical identity of A. Therefore, A is not B, but this doesn't imply that every level of abstraction and identity that symbols cannot be both simultaneously in both identity, unity, and numeration. Numerical value, for instance, infinity has both its identity and its property of boundlessness, yet has the sets of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Yet pi or infinity is neither contained or opposed by addition or numeration, by its simplicity, as I read Rudy Rucker explain. In its apophatic nature, diversity is not in a position that which is essentially absolute diversity, and absolute unity is true and only a form of monotheism. Again, I've said the A and the B. When I have a table of A's and B's, A equals B only if B is A, therefore A is A. It cannot be both A and B, according to the level of distribution of first-order predicate logic, as I said before. Pi or infinity. Infinity possesses numerous properties. Boundlessness, non-extensional, formless, simple, immutable, necessarily existent, cannot be contained. Infinity represents E equals C only if the value of C represents a sum of E without saying there's actual sum of parts in infinity. Therefore, E is C. Only if by the conditional how infinity cannot be formally contained in the first order of predicate logic. Neither divided nor opposed nor multiplied in so much as 1, 2, and 3, and 4 in terms of arithmetic, the numerical value cannot be correspondent to the model of pi infinity, due to what I've explained earlier. Because, as I've said, the principle which makes it possible at all in terms of the higher levels of order predicate logic, in terms of problems of math, is what we call mathematical logic or meta-logic. This gets into the topic of logical realism and mathematical realism, rather than constructivism, which hinged upon a nominalist, quote-unquote positivist view of ontology separates from language, which it doesn't, because the ancient world, so far as the classics are concerned, never made a separation between ontology, classical ontology, or essential ontology, as we call it today, with language, because to know is being. This is what they believed. To divide that is to separate the world of thought from the world in front of us. So you get the problem of immediacy versus non-immediacy, or indeterminacy, which again gets in a whole other issue with free will, libertarian free will, and vice versa. This has been my first recording. I hope it went well. I hope you enjoyed. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.